Next is the session number 3, Great Power Competitions and Future of the Indo-Pacific. The moderator for this session is from Nikkei Inc. commentator Akita Hiroyuki. Akita-san, Mr. Akita, I will hand over the microphone to you. Thank you so much. Today, it's a kind of a long symposium, and I would like to thank you for your patience. This will be the last session of the symposium. The first session and the second session, there must have been a lot of the questions and a little bit of some anxiety, not just on you, but in me as well. But there's just questions and anxiety. In this session, we hope that we can come up with some kind of answers, some kind of responses. So in that sense, I mean, we couldn't hope for the better members of the panel than this. We couldn't go any better. First, Daniel Russell, right next to me. You are now with the Asia Society Policy Institute Vice President during Obama's administration. You were served as the Assistant Secretary of State, and you have been engaged in Asia policies, East Asia policies, very deeply. Next, Mr. Ashok Malik, partner and chair of India Practice, the Asia Group. Mr. Malik, at the India Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you were again Deputy Secretary and also Policy Advisor, Additional Secretary in India's Ministry of External Affairs, and you also were Principal Speechwriter and spokesperson for the President of India, have engaged in India's foreign policies very deeply. Next to Professor Emeritus, the University of Tokyo, Professor Kitaoka, you are also the president of JICA for quite a long time, and as a kind of a brain, you have participated in various policy making. You don't really need much introduction, Professor Kitaoka. Very great to have you here. And Dr. Michael Green, you know him very well. You are now the United States Studies Center, University of Sydney. During Bush administration, you were Director of Asian Studies and Chair in Modern Contemporary Japanese Politics. And for quite a long time, you have been engaged in the policies concerning this particular area. In this session, this is how I would like to proceed. 2 rounds. I would like to have 2 rounds of discussions, and then looking at the questions from the audience, from the floor, we would like to proceed. In the first round, so far, we discussed the Trump administration's issues. And although this has not really been discussed much, looking at the global arena as something that has an impact on this, Russia's aggression to Ukraine, or President Putin of Russia, what kind of actions he might take, and the Middle East situation, the impact of that here in Japan. And the United States has the strongest military in the world, but having one major war and then deter the another, that's about it. So this could have an impact on this region. So the first question, in this order, I would like to ask you questions. President Trump, revival, and then the situation in Ukraine and the situation in the Middle East. On this particular region, what kind of the impact will it have in this region? It's like asking you to come up with a conclusion first, but the worst case scenario, if you just could personally come up with the worst case scenario. I'm a journalist, so I tend to ask that kind of a worst case scenario. So please share your worst case scenario. Dr. Russell, please.
Thank you, Akita-san. We've got a rich menu of worst-case scenarios to pick from, I'm afraid. In terms of the impact of the return to government of Donald Trump, I'd start by reminding us of what we heard from Takahara-sensei and the other speakers, namely it depends on which Trump are we talking about. As Rush said, it depends on what's the balance of power between Trump decision-making and his team's decision-making. I'd also say that we should expect the response and the reaction to Trump to play out in stages. I think we're in the shock and fear stage right now, but it will evolve over the next 4 years. And we should expect it to play out over different sectors. So the Trump administration's tariff and economic policies, national security, military defense policies, technology policies, diplomatic and geopolitical policies. So it will unfold over time. I think you're right to focus on the impact of the wars in Ukraine and in the Middle East. These are indirect threats, but they certainly shift the focus and bandwidth and energy of decision makers in Washington and elsewhere away from the Indo-Pacific. Unquestionably, we're seeing an erosion of the principles of the UN Charter. We're seeing manifest evidence that the UN Security Council can't deal with these crises, can't even seem to function. It's exposing, in some ways, the limits of US and of Western power. We, the United States and the West, couldn't prevent Russia from invading, even though we saw it unfolding. We've applied sanctions, and those sanctions haven't actually caused Putin to stop or to withdraw. I think it also carries very alarming implications for Taiwan to see the transition from gray zone activities, which Russia was undertaking in Ukraine, to black and white conflict, invasion. That just proves it can happen and is quite worrisome in the Taiwan context. It has cemented China's support for Russia, and it's cemented Russian-North Korea cooperation. These are strategically very adverse, very negative developments from the West's point of view. It's given North Korea a lot of leverage over China and therefore no restraint. And I think the key point on the Middle East war would be that it has badly alienated Muslim majority countries in Southeast Asia and generated a sense of double standards at a time when regional cohesion and regional unity is really needed. So picking up from that in terms of worst case scenarios, I think there are two really, and they're hiding in plain sight. One is a scenario in which China shifts from gray zone intimidation to a more direct use of military force, either against Taiwan or against the Philippines. And I don't mean a full-on amphibious invasion of Taiwan, but simply crossing the threshold of actually hitting something, actually killing someone, actually destroying something, in part to test the question of America first isolationism, what will Trump do, in part to reveal the limits of the US security guarantees, that the US couldn't prevent it and so on. And secondly, I think we're looking at an emboldened North Korea, and there's a huge risk of North Korea escalating not just a seventh nuclear test, but something more dangerous, an atmospheric test, or even a use of tactical battlefield nuclear weapons against, say, an uninhabited island in the Yellow Sea. So there's a tremendous amount to worry about in terms of worst case scenarios.
どうもありがとうございます。
Thank you so much. Now it looks like I'm just have the materials to be concerned and then have anxiety. But in the next round, I'd like to ask you how we could respond. So in this round, we just focus on the worst case scenarios. Let's see. Mr. Malik, having listened to those previous comments, so once again, in this dangerous world situation from India, how do you look at the situation? In India's case, you have these relations with Pakistan, Afghanistan, South Asia. There are a lot of the seas for conflicts. So the worst case scenario, What's the worst case scenario from India?
Relationship that matters and is a challenge, and that is China. And every other country you spoke about, in a sense, the challenge from that country gets subsumed under the China challenge. That is a reality today. So in that sense, we're not very different from many other countries in the Indo-Pacific. You raised the question of the three ongoing conflict zones: Ukraine, the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific. I'll try and address all three. In the Ukraine-Russia conflict, which began with Russia's egregious invasion of Ukraine in February 22, the fact is there is a certain realization, I wouldn't call it a fatigue, but a certain realization that you're not going to see a definitive outcome to the conflict, at least in this round, on the battlefield. And some sort of a compromise, a frozen conflict, if you will, a non-war or a war of attrition, is perhaps the best immediate answer. It's not a solution, but it's the best answer. I think there's greater buy-in for that than we admit even to ourselves. There are elements in the important voices in the Biden administration who realize that. Trump has spoken about that. Even some European countries are talking about that. I do believe we will be headed towards some sort of a situation where there are military and economic guarantees and packages for Ukraine and some sort of a deal with Putin. Everyone likes to believe that Trump will offer an easy off-ramp to Putin. I'm not sure. I'm not even sure when he means I want to end all wars, whether he actually means he wants an end to all wars or he wants an end to what he considers the US over-resourcing other people's wars. I do believe he'd be quite happy to have Ukraine buy American weapons, provided the Europeans paid for it. So his off-ramp for Putin as well will be very carefully negotiated. I don't think we have a quick and easy solution to this conflict. We will probably see it tapering, but it will call for hard negotiation, especially between Putin and the Europeans, between Trump and the Europeans, and between Trump and Putin. Coming to the Middle East, what began in October last year as a terror attack on Israel and then became an attack against Hamas has now evolved. It's evolved into, quite honestly, a strategic conflict with Iran. And Iran has had to concede space. In Lebanon, amongst its auxiliaries, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. And there will be a temptation in Israel, and I would dare say even in the Trump camp and in Washington, to say that let Israel go further. Let's see how much strategic space we can grab from Iran in the coming months. I don't know what President Trump's determination will be, but I think the chances of Israel persisting with some sort of an assault on Iranian assets is not insignificant. Finally, coming to the Indo-Pacific, chances of a full-blown violent conflict here, while not negligible, are relatively low. Chances of strategic competition heightening are much, much higher. How will Trump respond, and how should all of us who have a stake in the American system, as it were, respond? I think there are four sort of instruments in the toolkit. One, of course, is heightened military activity by the Americans with their partners here, building more military capacities, as all three Quad countries have done, as Taiwan will likely be doing, which could actually help President Trump at home in terms of providing jobs to US defense factories, which could sell to many of the partner countries in Asia. That's one of the four instruments. The others are the technology partnerships, which have been taken forward in the past few years, which are a part of economic and composite national security today in this part of the world or anywhere. The third is supply chains. We talk about integrating supply chains. I would not go that far. I would say if you can harmonize supply chains, especially in critical areas, that would help. And the fourth, of course, is tariffs. All four can coexist. Of course, the relative weight of could be different. The weights could be different. My worst case scenario really would be if the tariff weight became disproportionate compared to the weight of the other three factors and instruments, in which case it will lead to a lot of countries in this part of the world, smaller countries especially, beginning to hedge even more. And hedging as a tactical response to an immediate situation is still understandable. If hedging stays too long and becomes a habit you can't shake off, it has strategic implications.
どうもありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. Professor Kitaoka, how about you? Professor Kitaoka, you are a historian. You are quite distinguished. You are involved in many research projects. And what Mr. Malik has said, in the 1930s, today, we have a risk which is quite similar to what the world faced back in the 1930s. The orders are crumbling, and each country needs to hedge for itself. And if you have the power, you would build up your military capability. In 1930s, the risks has heightened, which has culminated in the World War II. So that could be included in the world's worst-case scenario, the risks involved. So 3 minutes to 5 minutes? Okay. If I may follow up on what you have just suggested, based upon the reflection and soul-searching of what has happened before World War II, the dispute settlement using force has been forbidden in the UN Charter, and that under the GATT regime, the tariffs are to be brought down, but we now have major challenges to both of these systems. And thinking about East Asia, many people think that the environment surrounding Japan is the worst ever situation, the most difficult situation. But looking at the East Asian situation, including Japan, there is many changes are happening because of the Ukrainian war. The biggest change is happening in Japan because Japan is now trying to live up to its potential in terms of capability. In 2015, when peace legislation was brought forward by Abe administration, there was a lot of opposition, but within 3 years, his approval ratings have improved. And what was never thought at that time, the counterattack capabilities are now being included. And what is said to be 1%, now we have more than 2% defense the budget. That's to say GDP, 2%. And 3 security documents have been put forward by government of Japan in 2022, which is highly approved by the Japanese public. Of course, there's still a question of what to do with the financial source, the funding source. But to strengthen the military research capabilities are also to be improved. So the potential of Japan that has been dramatically increased, and that is the biggest change happening in East Asia. But you are saying that we have to talk about worries and concerns as well, rather than military aspects, more of a political aspects. Now, when Ukraine loses its war or have to give up the war, or with very highly disadvantageous situation, then it could spread over to the surrounding countries like the Georgia. The Russian-prone administration is in the majority, and in Hungary as well. There is a lot of opposition against supporting Ukraine. So there is stronger voice for Russia in the surrounding countries as well. The biggest anxiety is the liberal and democratic network in Europe may crumble. Same thing goes for Palestine. And for the JICA, there was mentioned by Professor Nye. He has given good assessment, and I am very grateful. At Jericho, we have Jericho Agro-Industrial Park is being promoted by JICA. Israel and Palestine and Jordan and Japan are having joint project. So this is also a two-state solution, one good model for that. I hope that we can reach a compromise in any conflict. That is my hope. So when and if Israel will attack on Hamas thoroughly and try to remove Hamas from Palestine totally, then for the other third world or the developing world countries, what may be the impact? In Indonesia and Malaysia, they're clearly for Palestine. And Indonesia may also move towards that. So in order to criticize Russia, there were 141 votes in the United Nations against Russia, but that could also collapse. So at the political level, with the Trump coming back, there's a lot of anxiety. On military aspects, I'm not that concerned. But as Ms. Malik has said, what to do with tariffs? This may have a very broad and deep undermining effect, even for the United States itself as well. To link to the earlier session, as Professor Sahashi has summarized well, in order to implement the policy, the role of experts, the staffs, will be very relevant and important. So we need to deepen our relationship, especially with the bureaucracy, the staffs. And that will be increasingly important. But Trump having the weapon of unpredictability, when and if China comes up with very attractive the package deal, what would happen? There's a lot of uncertainties. So my worst scenario is about Europe. And also, rather than military, it is more of a political level. And what may be the impact to be felt? Thank you.
Thank you. Last month, Latvia, 2 months ago, Georgia, Tbilisi, I had the chance to go there and attend a meeting. Just as you said, Professor Kitaoka, the same thing was discussed. Not militarily, but already Russia has the political influence and it's increasing. In various democracies, they are getting into those democracies. So they can't militarily beat NATO, but assassinations, sabotage, destructive efforts, information, disinformation, they're stabilizing the world already. It's somewhere close to World War III, and Europe is already being attacked. And that was one of the discussion in those meetings. So thank you. Dr. Green, I mean, you are the fourth batter to speak the analogy of baseball. So you could just refer to all the points, worst case scenarios, including all the worst case scenarios. Your turn, sir.
Thank you. So I think when Donald Trump comes into the Oval Office, he's going to confront a very different world from the one he confronted in 2017. And what will be most striking is that the confrontation and crises in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, and North Korea are now much more closely tied together. The historian Hal Brands has argued that the cooperation between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea in terms of technology, munitions, troops, and diplomacy is probably more significant than the collaboration between Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany in World War II. I think he's right. And so this is becoming one front. Reports are that Russia is helping the Houthi rebels, an Iranian proxy group, target shipping. We know, we've discussed North Korean troops in Ukraine. Russia and China are blocking any pressure on North Korea in the UN, and the list goes on and on. So the most important implication of these conflicts really strategically should be that we must recognize it's increasingly one front. The Trump administration has different views, as Rush and others pointed out. The new Vice President, J.D. Vance, and others have the view that the U.S. has to retreat from Europe to deal with China. Some of them even believe that a Russia card can be used. Somehow the U.S. can separate Russia and China. That's a terrible, terrible strategy. And I don't think it will survive the first 6 months of the Trump administration. There's no Russia card to use on China. What there is a Europe card. And the Biden administration began to play that card. The Trump administration is coming in quite hostile to Europe. And frankly, European political leaders are too hostile towards Trump. And that transatlantic tension may be the best news for China of all right now. And there's a history to this. The America First movement, the first America First movement in 1939, 1940, also in some ways was an Asia First movement. The leaders were very anti-Europe. In Gallup polling in 1940, 2/3 of Americans said we shouldn't intervene in the war in Europe to save Britain. But in the same Gallup polls, 2/3 of Americans said we should stop Japan in Asia, even if it means risking war. When the same isolationists, people like Senator Robert Taft of Ohio, the state where J.D. Vance is from, when they opposed NATO after World War II, their argument was we have to pivot to Asia, we have to stop communist China, we have to support Chiang Kai-shek. And J.D. Vance, when he was in Munich at the security conference, gave a speech saying we have to pull back from Ukraine so we can pivot to deal with China. So Japan is probably our most important ally in making sure that the transatlantic and trans-Pacific alliances remain locked together. Japan, probably more than Australia or Korea, New Zealand, has strong ties to Europe, is in the G7, is more active in the IP4 with NATO. So I think this is one really important lesson. Japan has a particular role to play, as Abe-san did last time. On the Middle East, of course, that's also related to these other areas of conflict. I personally expect the Trump administration will emphasize deterrence towards Iran. And in my own view, that's good. I agree with Ashok. Israel is stealing some strategic initiative away from Iran in the region. I think they will get enthusiastic support from the Trump administration to keep doing that. I expect President Trump will give Mr. Netanyahu a lot more support, but will tell him, get it done quickly. And I expect that the Gulf states will actually be quite satisfied with this because they don't really care about the Palestinian people, they're worried about Iran. But there will be collateral damage to America's strategic position in Asia, in Southeast Asia. And the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies does an annual survey, and the views of elites in Southeast Asia towards the US collapsed the last 2 years, mainly because of Gaza. So that's another homework assignment for Japan, is also sort of, and Australia and other US allies, is helping to control that collateral damage. Finally, in terms of hotspots, as you know, Danny said, it's a smorgasbord, a chanko nabe of hotspots. But I just put one forward to think about. We tend to think in terms of kinetic war. Where will the conflict erupt? I'm focused on something a little bit different. I think China's strategy on Taiwan is focused on the center of gravity. And the center of gravity is the will of the people on Taiwan. And it's much more fragile than people realize. After the Ukraine war, a majority of people in Taiwan believed the US wouldn't defend them because we had not sent troops to Ukraine. Now, I met with others, Tsai Ing-wen, and she didn't believe that. She thought that the Biden administration's approach to Ukraine was very helpful for Taiwan, but the public was nervous. Why didn't the US send troops into Ukraine? And for certain, Chinese propaganda and disinformation was fueling that. So I worry more about a quote unquote peaceful collapse of our strategic position. Not this year, not next year, but over time. And that means deterrence is important, but it also means thinking strategically and diplomatically how we reinforce confidence in Taiwan. That to me is the Achilles heel.
どうもありがとうございます。今の話を聞いていてちょっと思い出したのは
As I have been listening to what has been said, I remember, this is how I understand it, the North Korea, in terms of weather, it is like a flooding or tornado. It is just a one-time phenomenon. So one time something happens, but that's it. But Russia is a big hurricane. It comes repeatedly and destroys things. But hurricane would peak out and then fade out. That is the kind of threat. But threat of China is a climate change. That's to say, for the whole globe, the political regime will be gradually be changed for many, many years, just like climate change. So that is how I would like to say the analogy. This could be the worst scenario if that happens. Now, let us have another round of question and answers. The time is running, but if I may introduce to you the questions from the audience. So in the next round, you can touch upon those questions from the audience as well, but you don't really have to do so if you cannot do so. Now, just 1 week ago, I have written a column where I said that the situation right now is something akin to what has happened just before the World War II. Now, what Professor Takahara has mentioned, the West Pacific the Union, and what Prime Minister Ishiba contends, the Asian version of NATO. So as going forward, for the way forward, as a prescription for the future, how should we think all these propositions? And we should also take up the issue of climate change at the same time. That's to say, the issues other than political security matters. And then there's another question. When contingency happens in Taiwan, how should Japan respond? So if I may start from, once again, Mr. Russell, there has been many questions being raised in the first round. So how should we prioritize? Because if you mention everything, it would take another hour. So if you could prioritize and give us some prescriptions how to deal with those issues, please.
I love the analogy between China and climate change. The question is whether we can keep the temperature from rising more than 1.5 degrees as we go forward. So with respect to Taiwan, first, I very much agree with Mike Green that we shouldn't be fooled into thinking that there is a risk of war versus peace, because it is really the insidious, coercive effort to isolate Taiwan, to demoralize the people on Taiwan, to discredit the authorities on Taiwan and the security guarantees of the United States or the interests of the world that puts Taiwan at great risk. And that's something that we need to push back against. So I think my sort of first remedy would be to work to boost Taiwan resilience. Now, some of that sure is asymmetric military capability. A lot of it is based on the realization that probably the most precious resource in a potential conflict scenario is time. And so for Taiwan to stockpile the energy and the medical equipment, the things that it would need to buy time, for it to upgrade its civil defense and its emergency capacity, that's important. But I think above all, it is a cohesive message of deterrence, of the unity of the U.S., Japan, others, to oppose escalation against Taiwan. In the South China Sea, there too, I think it's really the collaborative effort that will make a difference, working to build a sustainable and inclusive maritime security program, so that the Chinese don't have the option of simply zeroing in on the Philippines, zeroing in on the Vietnamese. Because at root, we're not defending a particular island or shoal or land feature or even a country. We're defending international waters and international rights and international laws. And we all have a stake in that. Third, with respect to North Korea, deterrence is absolutely critical. And so in that respect, strengthening our trilateral US, Japan, Korea defense and deterrence is needed. That means missile defense. It means rapid response protocols. It means being clear about consequences to North Korea. It means an effort to block the technology sharing from Russia to North Korea. None of this is easy. On the economic side, obviously, we need and will do more to reduce China's strategic leverage over Japan, over the United States, whether it's critical technologies or infrastructure and so on. I think there's a lot of work to be done with the U.S. public to strengthen public support and to reinforce the U.S. and Japan commitment to Indo-Pacific stability through public diplomacy, to convey the strategic logic and the benefits of U.S. involvement and to counter isolationist pressure. So there's a big set of work ahead of us. I think that the good news is that there's a very strong, deep, resilient U.S. commitment, foundational commitment. As others have mentioned, it's driven in part by fear and concern about China, but is also, I think, reflective of a strong belief that the U.S. is a Pacific nation and that we have interests and a value placed on alliances. So that's good. Frankly, the fact that our long-term force posture commitments and our very substantial investments give a lot of momentum and are not easy to unwind should also be something of a consolation. I think we should think of the America First approach, which does have an isolationist feel to it, as pressure for increased defense contribution, burden sharing, responsibility by allies and partners, not as abandonment. I don't think that's the intended message. And lastly, I think if we think in terms of the sort of triad of Japan and other partners taking on more responsibilities, developing their own capabilities, and framing their asks and proposals in ways that would be easy for the American people and for the president to understand as serving U.S. interests, I think that there's a recipe for managing the next 4 years.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you so much. Mr. Malik, about India. You don't have a treaty that you need to be protected by the United States. You are so different from Japan. March, I went to India. I asked many people, rather than Biden administration, the majority of the people that I met, they liked Trump administration better. So the recipe, prescription of India is not predicated on the U.S. hegemony. I mean, they are not denying this, but Indians don't have to depend on the United States. You can design a new prescription by yourselves, by Indians. So from India's perspective, when you look at Indo-Pacific, how can we maintain the stability in the Indo-Pacific?
To your basic question, my answer is both a yes and a no. We are not treaty allies. We don't have U.S. troops defending us. But the U.S. remains our most consequential international relationship. Military, non-military, technology, economic, composite national security, call it what you will. So we will always have a rich agenda with any American president. We had a rich agenda with Biden. We'll have a rich agenda, I have no doubt, with Trump or whoever follows. I think we need to recognize one overarching verity, which is not just limited to Trump, which is that U.S. foreign policy managers, U.S. International engagement managers today don't have the domestic agency and autonomy that they did in the 80s or the 90s. Resources are constrained, publics are asking questions. That is a reality. And this will create gaps in areas where we've all come to depend on an untrammeled U.S. presence. How do we fill those gaps? In some cases, we keep America engaged and keep it there. In some cases, we try and fill those gaps as we can with complementary minilaterals or arrangements that don't involve the US but are not hostile to it, of course. For India, what would be most important with the incoming Trump administration would be to reinforce the importance of Quad. As has been pointed out, Quad became a minister-level format in September 2019 when the 4 foreign ministers met in New York. And they met again in this city, in Tokyo, in 2020, I believe, if I remember correctly. And of course, President Biden took it even further to make it a summit-level meeting. So when Trump looks at Quad, he'll probably look at it with some satisfaction as something he helped push. Also, when he looks at the Quad partners, as I said earlier, Japan's defense budget has increased, thanks to Trump's urging to some degree. Australia is putting more money into AUKUS and the submarines. There are some controversies about it in Washington, but the fact is Australia is putting money into capacities. India does not depend on US troops. It is buying more and more US equipment. It is harmonizing with US defense and security postures. The Quad model is really what Trump would probably take to Europe and say, look, this is what the Quad countries are doing, can't you do the same? Second, we have to incentivize the US and Trump into staying the course in this part of the world. For India, the military and technology partnership with the US is a paramount priority. If preserving those equities means some concessions in terms of a trade deal or in terms of market access, I suspect we'll do it. Exactly what the contours will be, what the details will be, will need to be worked out between two sets of very difficult trade negotiators, but I am sure we'll come to a deal. It's a strategic imperative. Finally, there are many friends and partners of the US in this part of the world who can act together even if the US is not there. And they'll do this in preserving a template that the US helped create. In the far western end of the Indo-Pacific, the India, UAE, India Gulf generally, defense relationship is strengthening. And what India did against the Houthis and other pirates in the Arabian Sea and the Gulf of Aden earlier this year, there was evidence of that. India, Japan, and Korea is an emerging triangle. India, Australia, and New Zealand, the foreign ministers met as a collective for the first time in Canberra last week. And there's a likelihood of a more formal trilateral taking place next year. If we need to keep our Australian and New Zealander friends interested in the Indian Ocean and South Asia, we need to support them in the Pacific Islands. We need to work together. And I guess more and more countries would try to do that to fill the gap that the US is leaving.
ありがとうございます。ちなみにこう
Thank you very much. Now, having collaborative assistance in terms of natural disasters and also pipelines in the Cuba and other countries. There are so many questions that are being collected, but if we are to deal with them, it would take another 1.5 hours. So we should concentrate on what we are dealing right now. About the West Pacific, the union concept, the United States was not included. So, are you thinking of something else? This is something of a different level. If I may go back, the best solution in trying to avoid the worst scenario is to strengthen the security capability of Japan. For many, many years, the missile defense has been advocated by Japan against North Korea. But I have been saying that it would take too long a time. So we need to have a counterattack capability. This is something of a basics for deterrence. And after 10-some years, at last, the government is taking up my thought. Now, historically speaking, China is very cautious militarily. So when China thinks that it cannot win easily, they would never ever take such action. For the Taiwan Straits, when China begins a military attack, people will die and vessels will be submerged. And so this is very different from Russia has done. And the prisoners have been used, and also minority people has been used. And they have always tried in China not to have any negative impact on the center. But when war erupts, that would mean that children may have to die. And the Chinese people will be absolutely against that. What China needs is to maintain its regime, and especially Xi Jinping would like to survive and continue its regime. So it will be political propaganda and try to shake Taiwan. And on the other hand, Taiwan is not well prepared. The energy and other resources are in shortage, so they need more stockpiling. And in terms of semiconductor, they are prosperous, but electricity is not enough. So the preparation on the Taiwanese side is not enough at all. Now, the top priority would be Japan to enhance our own capability. And the battlefield is not only military battlefield, but also political battlefield needs to be considered. So what is the most, the concern would be Russia and China. And China is trying to widen BRICS network and trying to make it anti-United States. So the developing countries, there are more than 130 developing countries in the United Nations. And those stronger group are made up of developing countries. And China is trying to bring them together to make it the anti-U.S. group. And from the year 2000, Japan has always worked to have a better relationship with India. And Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Abe were very close and in good and having good chemistry. And whenever they meet, they were always very happy. And another the country which is also the great power amongst the developing countries and included in BRICS, for example, Mexico, is a new member of OECD, and Turkey is a regional member of OECD, and Indonesia would also like to join the OECD. For those top-ranking developing countries, we need to woo them closer to us. And also, the majority are the smaller and weaker countries, and they are protected because of rule of law. If it is rule of force and power, nobody would help these countries. So try to bring those weaker and smaller countries to us as well. And JICA, if I may touch upon this, JICA is always thinking about the developing nations. Of course, we have good relationship with Pakistan. Pakistan is close to China. But what about the people in Pakistan? They are more closer to people like Japanese. And like it is it is a Muslim country, so women is poorly treated, and the illiteracy abound in the women because women need to be protected. Women should not travel a distance, so women should not go to schools. But the JICA will be silent on these questions, but we will build smaller schools closer to homes for women, and try to encourage those smaller and weaker countries to come to our side is what we need to do. So military alliance, Japan and U.S. alliance, will be unwavering and unshaken. I am strictly opposed to what Mr. Ishiba is saying, the Asian version of NATO. Because many of the Southeast Asian countries do not want to confront China, and they would like to continue trade with China. The time is running. No, 30 seconds, I know. But they do not want to succumb to China either. So they need U.S. presence. And Japan-U.S. security treaty and to try to protect those countries and to strengthen our relations with the Southeast Asian countries. That is my central concept.
Understood. Dr. Green.
3 priorities to maintain deterrence and stability. First, don't shoot yourself in the foot. This is not the time to be debating status of forces agreement SOFA revision in the U.S.-Japan alliance. It's contentious, it's distracting. Maybe have a broader discussion about dual use of bases, Japanese forces rotating to Australia and U.S. as the Armitage-Nye report suggests, but don't do SOFA right now. On the U.S. side, don't start firing admirals and generals. In the years before World War II, General Marshall in the U.S. picked a few key generals to promote because he thought they were better warfighters, warriors. And it served the U.S. military well. But in Russia, Stalin purged the Red Army to get rid of generals who were not loyal. And when Germany attacked, the Red Army collapsed. So let's not do stupid things. Second, let's create an Asian NATO, except that we can't. But the one thing NATO really teaches us, or U.S. Combined Forces Korea with Korea, is that having a C2, joint and combined command relationships, is absolutely critical for deterrence and success. We're doing more with Australia, we're doing more with Korea than ever before, but until we accelerate and institutionalize command and control relationships that are now being discussed, generals won't know exactly what their authority is. People, who's going to do what job. And so that's critical. And then the last thing is, Admiral Aquilino likes to use this phrase in Hawaii, but we have to do more to seize the initiative. China, Russia, the other side is, especially China, has the momentum, has the initiative. They surprise us. We need to surprise them. But important caveat, we hurt ourselves if we surprise our allies. You can't have a joint strategy and a joint force with allies if you surprise them and if they don't trust you. So we need to come up with ways to seize the initiative where the US and Japan and Australia, the US and Japan and Korea, surprise China or undermine their assumptions about the strength of their position. A very good example of this was AUKUS. I see Abe Denmark's here, who was in charge of AUKUS in the Pentagon. Australia, UK, US, incredibly bold vision, especially for nuclear-powered submarines for Australia, completely changed the chessboard. Some people didn't like it, but that was bold. We need bold things, US, Japan, Korea especially, US, Japan, Australia, to seize the initiative. I think if we do those things, there's every reason why the success of the alliance in keeping peace will continue. But we can't do business as usual.
どうもありがとうございました。
Thank you so much. It is right on spot of time. There is still 30 seconds for me to make a comment, but just one point. My takeaway. There are 2 things that I would like to mention. Now, war or peace. Binary thinking prevails, but you need to think about the gray zone risk. That is the most dangerous, is what we need to think through. And secondly, what to do and how to deal with the situation. We had the 4 batters, the first at bat, second at bat, third at bat, and fourth at bat. We should not go for home runs, but we should go for hits. Because there's no home run situation. We need to accumulate good hits and then have a score of 10-0, or maybe 10-9 would be enough. And no errors. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Russell. No errors. That's very important. Thank you. And a big applause for the panelists, please. Thank you.
All the speakers, thank you so much. Please join me with a great round of applause to thank all the panelists and the moderator. With this, we would like to conclude the 21st CSIS Nikkei Symposium, Shaping the Future, New Leadership in Japan, US, and Next Indo-Pacific Order.